Welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few, USPIE's weekly podcast that empowers parents to reclaim their children's education from government bureaucrats and social engineers. In each episode, Sherry delivers the latest news from the front lines of the fight for the minds of the next generation, equipping you with the tools and resources needed to join the cause.
Hi everyone, welcome to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. I'm your host, Sherry Few, and I have another great show for you today. Joining me is Will Estrada, Senior Legal Counsel at the Homeschool Legal Defense Association and President of ParentalRights.org. Before I bring him on, please give us a 5-star rating and subscribe to the show. And be sure to visit USPIE.org to learn more and to join the movement.
Today's episode is brought to you by U.S. parents involved in education. USPIE's mission is to empower parents and local communities to break free from federal and national influences, thereby reclaiming parental authority over their children's education. For more insights from U.S. parents involved in education, connect with us at USPIE on X and Facebook. To join the movement, visit uspie.org.
Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. My guest today is Will Estrada, and Will began his legal career at Homeschool Legal Defense Association in 2004 and later directed HSLDA's Federal Relations Department, serving as its federal lobbyist. From 2018 to 2021, Will worked at the Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services before becoming the first full-time president of ParentalRights.org. In 2023, he returned to HSLDA as senior counsel, advocating for homeschooling rights across multiple states. Will is admitted to the U.S. Supreme Court and several federal and state bars. Himself a homeschool graduate, Will lives in Northern Virginia with his wife and 2 sons. Will Estrada, welcome to the podcast.
Sherry, it's great to be on. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm a big fan of yours, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers will have that same sentiment. So we're really thrilled you could be with us today. But before we dive into our discussion, here's a short video to give our viewers a glimpse of your work. Let's watch.
Homeschooling today is freer than it's ever been. And more families are fully embracing that freedom. But pendulums swing. Especially after COVID, critics of homeschool freedom are making their voices heard. Homeschool freedom is regularly being challenged in the press and in academia. And we already know that legislative season will see concerted efforts to roll back hard-fought freedoms in several states. At the root of this opposition is a perspective that doesn't fully understand homeschooling and the freedom that makes it tick. But we at HSLDA look at things differently. We believe that the homeschooling movement has succeeded exactly because of an environment of freedom. Restricting that freedom would undermine the very reason that homeschooling works so well for so many families. Children thrive when they are free to learn at their own pace and in their own way. HSLDA's mission has always been to advocate for homeschool freedom in the courtrooms, in the state houses, and in the media. At HSLDA, we are advocates for homeschooling. As we prepare for the challenging year ahead, we know that we can't do it alone. Just as the homeschooling movement in the early days banded together to win homeschool freedom, we must unite to defend it. Won't you join us as advocates for homeschool freedom?
That's a great video. I'm sure a lot of people have woken up and supported your work through that video. So let's jump right into what's happening in Springfield, Illinois, where I believe you have joined parents in protesting House Bill 2827, known as the Homeschool Act, which places requirements on homeschooling families, and if they don't comply, they could face up to a Class C misdemeanor, punishable by up to 30 days in jail.
Well, Sherry, that is definitely the truth. And I think the easiest way to describe what HB 2827 would do is first just take a step back and look at the big picture. In the 70s and 80s, homeschooling was illegal in most of the 50 states. Today, it's legal in all 50 states. It's really become mainstream. But in recent years, and you saw that a little bit in the video that we just played with the president of HSLDA and my boss, Jim Mason, we're starting to fear that we're beginning to see the pendulums shift a bit. There have now, in the past few months, been two bills in two states introduced that would roll back homeschool freedom. The first one was here in Virginia. It was a bill called SB 1031, which was introduced just a few months ago. Thankfully, that bill failed in committee. Homeschooling is still free in Virginia. But the second shoe to drop and the second part of that pendulum shift that we're fearing to see is exactly what you mentioned, HB 2827 in Illinois. In 1950, homeschooling became legal in Illinois because of the landmark Illinois Supreme Court case of People versus Levison. So when I mentioned a few moments ago how homeschooling was illegal in many of the 50 states in the 70s and 80s, not so in Illinois. Because of People versus Levison, actually families would move to Illinois to seek freedom to be able to educate their children and choose the best educational model for them. HB 2827 would roll back that 75 years of Illinois Supreme Court precedent. It's a 60-page bill. I've got the first 30 pages here in front of me. It would do several things. It would require families to now register with the government. They would be subject at any time for an evaluation by the public education system to see what their educational portfolio showed, to see if their education was commensurate with the Illinois public schools. And then most troubling, and you alluded to this, is if you did not file this piece of paperwork. It's called the Homeschool Declaration Form. It's not yet been drafted, but it's referenced in this proposed bill. You would get a 10-day grace period, and then you'd be subject to criminal penalties. It's a Class C misdemeanor. It would be truancy in Illinois, which could include obviously a criminal conviction, potential removal of children by DCFS, but it would be a up to 30 days in prison or a $500 fine. Sherry, not a single state in the United States, not even the most highly regulated states like Pennsylvania, New York, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, make it an automatic criminal penalty simply for failing to file a piece of paperwork. And so this has really motivated homeschoolers, private schoolers. The bill also goes after traditional brick and mortar private school families. I testified against the bill last week when it was up in the House Education Policy Committee. It was a marathon 3-hour hearing. But the biggest story was between 5,000 and 8,000 homeschoolers came out to the Illinois Capitol. So many came out that the authorities had to shut down access to the Capitol building. There were still about 500 people who were outside who never were able to get into the Capitol, but they refused to go home. They just wanted to stand there in solidarity with their friends who were able to make it into the Capitol, and we peacefully protested and made our voices heard. Now, despite all of that, the bill did pass out of committee. It was an 8-4 vote, but one Democrat, Illinois State Representative Fred Crespo, spoke out against the bill in committee. He refused to vote with the supporters of the bill. He voted present. And we have heard more and more members from both the Republicans and Democrats saying they cannot support the bill. So even though the bill is pending on the Illinois House floor, even though it passed out of committee, there has been no action on it. The Illinois House has recessed until April 7th. And so stay tuned. The battle is just getting started to protect homeschool and private school freedom in Illinois.
Wow, that's a pretty exciting story. And I've been reading a little bit about it, and I was so excited to learn that so many homeschooling parents showed up. And I also read in one of the news stories that there were 50,000 witness slips were submitted in this case.
Let me just kind of put that in context, Sherry. So in Illinois, they don't really give you an opportunity to testify in person against a bill. It's very limited. There were 4 of us who testified against the bill and 4 who testified for the bill. But what they do is they encourage Illinois residents to fill out witness slips. And prior to this, the highest record was a vaccine registry bill, I think a couple years ago, that got about 38,000 witness slips filed against it. And then the number 3 one was was back in 2011, which was the last time there was an attempt to regulate homeschoolers. There were about 35,000 witness slips filed against the bill. Those 50,000 witness slips that were filed against the bill, there was an amendment, so that happened in less than 24 hours. And it dwarfed the number of witness slips filed by supporters of the bill, which was 400 witness slips. And most of those were from out-of-state people who were from an out-of-state lobbying organization that supports HB 2827. So that is, they broke all records. It's the highest number of witness slips ever submitted against a bill in Illinois history, and it really speaks to the grassroots opposition from Illinois moms, dads, grandparents, kids who spoke out and who made their voices heard against HB 2827.
We have a USPIE president who is very active, and his kids actually attend government schools, but he's very active in speaking out against them. I know that Illinois is a very liberal state, but there are people that have common sense in that state, and we're seeing it through his activity in his PIE chapter there in Illinois. Lots of people, even if they vote Democrat, don't agree that, boys should be competing in women's sports, and children should be groomed at early ages into the transgender ideology. So we're seeing common sense prevailing in a very liberal state like Illinois, and it's refreshing to see.
One of the really interesting things is that post-COVID, we have seen incredible growth among homeschooling in the Black community, in the Latino community, and those people came out and they spoke up and said, we want to be able to homeschool, and this bill is going to affect us. It's going to disproportionately go after racial minorities, low-income families who can't maybe afford to hire an attorney to represent them. And so it's been really exciting to see Democrat legislators come out against HB 2827. They might have very little politically in common with Republican legislators, but they are united that this bill is going to harm homeschoolers. It's unnecessary. It's a bill, really a solution in search of a problem. And so it's been exciting to see kind of the entire homeschool community across the political spectrum, across racial, ethnic, socioeconomic statuses, but across the spectrum of just moms, dads, grandparents, kids coming out and saying, reject HB 2827. And it really speaks to the strength of the home education movement in today in 2025.
So you're so right, Will, and it's really about freedom, ultimately, and people understand that, and people want their freedom despite what position they might have on education policy, and they support others who want their freedom. So supporters of the bill argue, and I've heard this argument even in my own state. We're trying to pass a bill that would provide tax credits to parents who don't have their children enrolled in government schools. And so the argument, even from those who are sponsoring the bill from us, they know what the pushback will be, and they say, oh, well, we need some sort of accountability. That's what the other side says. So the supporters of the bill in Illinois are saying the same thing, that it provides accountability and ensures children receive a quality education. My response would be, and then I'd love to hear yours, is who's holding the government schools accountable when on average across the country, at best, 30% of children can read and do math? So who's holding them accountable, and why do we need accountability when parents are the ones who need to hold educators and the government accountable?
Oh, Sherry, you're absolutely correct. If the public schools, and let me preface this by saying I am not against the public schools. I'm a huge fan of public education system in the United States. My dad spent 37 years as a special education teacher in the state of New York and the state of Pennsylvania. There are many dedicated teachers and administrators in our public education system, but the public education system is currently in crisis mode in the United States of America. There's no other way around it. If the public schools were doing well, maybe this would be a rational argument. But the recent NAEP scores, these are the Federal National Assessment of Education Progress scores, they showed that in Illinois public schools, tragically, only 1/3 of eighth graders in Illinois public schools are proficient in math and reading. We have Almost two-thirds of kids in Illinois public schools are functionally illiterate. This is a tragedy of epic proportions. And it's kind of a head scratching exactly what you said, Sherry, of why are we suddenly putting another burden on the public education system, monitoring the homeschoolers, when they can't even educate the children in their own schools? And so I made the argument when I was testifying against the bill that this is actually going to harm the public schools. They're already struggling. They're already underfunded, overworked, not enough resources. Why are we giving them an additional aspect of something they need to do? And then another argument we had was, oh, we need to do this to protect kids from abuse and neglect. And it's an ignorant argument, because there have been multiple peer-reviewed studies that have shown that homeschooled children are actually at lower risk of abuse and neglect. They're not being bullied. In fact, many parents are pulling their children out of public schools because of bullying, and the public schools being unable to stem this tide of horrific bullying, sometimes just from other kids, of kids in the public school system, where kids are having stomach cramps and psychological issues, and they're needing to see counseling and go on medication just because of the fear they have of getting on the bus or going to the local public school. And so these are the kids who would be harmed by more regulation. And so we've said, go actually and address this at the root issue. Give the Child Protective Services, in this case in Illinois, DCFS, more funding and more staff so that they can make sure that no kids are falling through the cracks. Don't make them suddenly, without any funding or additional support, have to monitor more children. It really is an argument that when you come and look at it, it's going to actually harm children who are truly at risk of abuse and neglect.
That's a really good perspective, and I appreciate you sharing that. And so we agree on most things. I'm not sure that I'll go so far as to say I'm a big fan of the government schools, but nonetheless, we agree on what's important here. And so we need to take a short break, but when we come back, I'd like to ask you about your work with Parental Rights Foundation. I'll be back with my interview with Will Estrada right after this.
Parents, be warned. Your children are learning Marxist critical theories, anti-American propaganda, and so-called social justice advocacy. Government schools teach that America is systemically racist, teaching children to hate themselves, each other, and their nation. Although many states have enacted legislation to curtail these insidious pedagogies, numerous educators circumvent the law to indoctrinate impressionable students. Recently, over 5,000 teachers across the country signed a pledge to continue teaching critical race theory, saying, "We refuse to lie to young people about U.S. history and current events, regardless of the law." While many states now prohibit teaching critical race theory, countless school districts have skirted the laws by using federal COVID relief money instead. Tune in next week for more insights from U.S. parents involved in education, and connect with us at USPIE on X and Facebook. To join the movement, visit USPIE.org.
Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. My guest today is Will Estrada, Senior Legal Counsel at the Homeschool Legal Defense Association and President of ParentalRights.org. Will, tell me about your work with the Parental Rights Foundation.
First of all, I'm no longer the president at ParentalRights.org or the Parental Rights Foundation. I stepped down in 2023 when I came on as senior counsel at the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. I am on the board of advisors of Parental Rights Foundation. That's our C3 legal and research arm. And then I'm on the board of advisors for parentalrights.org as well. So I'm still involved, still in a board capacity, but no longer president. The president of both organizations is Michael Ramey, who is a gifted researcher and speaker and who has spent his life working on parental rights issues. The best way to describe it is parental rights is the overarching issue. Where do you decide to educate your children, in public, private, or homeschool? How do you raise them? What do you teach them? What medical decisions do you make? That's the overarching umbrella. Homeschooling is part of the parental rights issue, but is much more narrow focus. And so when I was at parentalrights.org and Parental Rights Foundation and still in my advisory role, It's really an honor to work on these. There's a big issue in the public education system of how far do parental rights go. One of the interesting things is that 100 years ago, the battle over parental rights was whether private education, private schools could even exist. Two of the very first cases dealing with parental rights were both in the context of private schools. One was Wisconsin, one was Meyer versus Nebraska. That was in 1923. That was an issue of could parents choose to have their children learn a different language? This was specifically about German and German immigrants. Then 2 years later was Pierce versus Society of Sisters. That was back when the Ku Klux Klan was lobbying and got a bill passed in Oregon that actually banned private schools from existing. And so those two very first parental rights cases that went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, actually Pierce versus Society of Sisters, where the Supreme Court famously said the child is not the mere creature of the state. We're coming up on the 100th anniversary of that case in June of this year. And so those were the cases that actually first established parental rights and which protected private schools. And today, private schools are flourishing and thriving, and there's really no existential threat to them. Then in the 70s and 80s, and even some of the 90s, the battle was, did parental rights allow parents to homeschool their children? And the answer, thankfully, was yes. And so I'm actually an optimist because when you talk about parental rights, we won the battle over private schools. We are winning the battle over homeschools, although we still have to fight to defend our freedom, particularly in Illinois with HB 2827. But now the main focus is how far do parental rights go in the public school sphere. So in some ways, I'm an optimist when we look at the battle for parental rights, and it was a privilege to be able to be part of that fight when I was serving as the president of both Parental Rights Foundation and parentalrights.org.
How do you feel about vouchers and how that might threaten private schools? Because as our organization is opposed to government money going into private and home schools because we believe it will harm them and eventually the government will control them as well. So what's your thoughts on that?
At Homeschool Legal Defense Association, our leadership opposes vouchers or education savings accounts that go to homeschoolers. So I encourage our listeners to read a very thoughtful article that was written by my boss and our president, Jim Mason. You can just Google Jim Mason, HSLDA, Civic Virtue of Private Home Education. And he lays out the argument of the concerns that if you have government money going to private homeschool families, then one day there could be government regulations that could follow that as well. Now, when I said nuanced, we do not oppose vouchers or ESAs going to traditional brick and mortar private schools. That's outside of our lane. We advocate for homeschool freedom. And so on the private school side, there have been many thoughtful conservatives, the Heritage Foundation, for example, other organizations, Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida, President Trump, others have really advocated for the money to follow the child and to go to these traditional brick and mortar schools. And so far, there have not been really a lot of regulations that have followed those private schools. Now, I always kind of say that with the caveat. I remember working very closely when I was HSLDA's federal lobbyist with many of our friends in the Catholic private schools. And for many decades, these Catholic private schools had been able to receive federal education dollars, some of the Title I dollars, some of the special education dollars, free and reduced school lunch dollars. And what happened in the Obama presidency years, so from 2008 to 2016, is suddenly the U.S. Department of Education came back and said, oh, you are receiving these federal education dollars. You have to remove the crucifixes from your schools. You can't have the prayers and chapel in the Catholic private schools anymore. And so I've never forgotten that those Catholic sisters were trying to fight to protect their identity as Catholic private schools, and they were losing it because of these federal education dollars that they had received. So again, HSLDA is neutral on the issue of money going to traditional brick and mortar private schools. There are many good organizations that advocate for that. But just kind of a personal anecdote, I've never forgotten that they had received those dollars for decades, and then suddenly an administration came in and started trying to stop them from having their basically what made them Catholic private education. And so that's always a very sobering thought that I remember.
That's our greatest concern with the vouchers and the ESA. So I understand HSLDA's position to be neutral on that. We just happen to disagree with some of those other good conservative groups that you mentioned. We like to point out the case with Hillsdale College when they were accepting students that received federal funding, and the government came in and told them they were going to have to start, administering quotas and different things that they weren't willing to do. So that's why Hillsdale College does not accept any government funding, and it's all privately funded.
Yeah, and there are several colleges like that. Patrick Henry College does not take federal funds as a result of that. Hillsdale, obviously, Grove City College, Christendom College. I believe there's one other that is escaping me right now. And those institutions have thrived. It's difficult. They obviously don't get access to federal student aid and a lot of the federal grants, but never underestimate the power of private philanthropy. And that's how these institutions have really succeeded. And here at Homeschool Legal Defense Association, we have given away millions of dollars that have been given to us as tax-deductible donations from wealthy people who want to see private home education succeed. And we have given away millions of dollars to low-income families, to families who also don't want to get these government dollars, but still need assistance with their home education program. So it's been exciting to see how our tax code in the U.S. income tax system gives wealthy people, wealthy philanthropists, the ability to donate money to nonprofits, and then those nonprofits can turn around and give them without any strings attached to people who are trying to educate their children at home free from government control.
That's wonderful. And I think we all understand that if there wasn't such a heavy tax burden on families, they could make choices that they prefer without government involvement as well. And I think ultimately, when it comes to closing the U.S. Department of Education, returning local and parental control of education, we're going to need to see a reduction in tax collection. It's going to need to be shifted.
I'm a huge fan of that. I always tell our friends at the state and federal level, look, I get wanting to give ESAs or vouchers, but maybe you should just let people keep more of their hard-earned money in the first place rather than it come out of their pockets through taxation, go into the treasury, and then be given back to people. So instead, let's just cut the tax burden, cut out the middleman, let families keep more of their hard-earned dollars.
Okay, let's get back to the parental rights issue. That was a great conversation. I'm glad you indulged me there. But I wanted to talk about a case of a mom in Georgia, and I'd like for you to tell us about it. We're going to play a short news clip about it right now.
Mother of a 10-year-old boy couldn't believe it when cops showed up at her door, put her under arrest and in cuffs. But she says she was really shocked when they told her what she was being charged with, and you may be too. Allison Hall has details.
A mom of 4 is about to get the shock of her life when she opens the door to her home.
Turn around for me. Why? Because you're under arrest.
She's perplexed.
What am I under arrest for? For reckless endangerment.
Say what?
I was in a state of disbelief, really.
It turns out that unbeknownst to Brittany Patterson, her 10-year-old son had gone off on his own to a dollar store in town, about a mile away. Cops got involved when a passerby saw the boy and called them.
I figured he just, was out in the woods or went to grandma's house.
Deputies picked up her son, Soren, and drove him back to the house in rural Georgia. The population of the town is just 223. 5 hours later, cops returned with an arrest warrant, saying young Soren had been gone for about an hour, while mom had taken another child to a doctor's appointment.
Last time I checked, it wasn't illegal for a kid to walk to the store.
So. It is when they're 10 years old.
It was humiliating, especially the part where I had to, strip down and get into jail clothes.
Social media is in an uproar, calling the arrest an overreach. Ridiculous. Absurd. Other commenters are less sympathetic. If something had happened to that kid, everyone would be up in arms, asking where his mother was. Lawyer David DeLugas represents Brittany.
It's not a crime to not know where your nearly 11-year-old child is at every minute of every day.
You're going to fight this, from what I understand.
Yes, I am. I don't think any parent should be arrested for making a decision that they think is safe for their child and for their family.
Wow, what an interesting story. So I'd like you to comment, Will, on what the mom said at the end.
She is absolutely right, Sherry. And I'll be honest with you, I am very familiar with this case with Brittany Patterson. I know David DeLugas, her attorney, but I had never actually seen that video of the arrest. And watching it, I cannot believe that in America there'd be a cop who would do, well, maybe I can post COVID actually with some of the things that happened, but it's an embarrassment. The thing is that this has not happened just in Georgia to Brittany Patterson. I can tell you countless stories of homeschoolers who their kids were done with school and they were playing on the cul-de-sac, people who've been in the media. And the good thing is there's an organization called Let Grow. The founder is Lenore Skenazy. She has made it her life's mission to pass what are called reasonable independence for kids laws. At HSLDA, we have been working very closely with them for years. I was involved a couple years ago when I was at Parental Rights Foundation in supporting one of these laws in Virginia. It sailed through unanimously. Our star witness was a homeschool mom and her 10-year-old daughter. Although the mom had not been arrested, the cops had shown up. They had threatened the mom. They had threatened the 10-year-old daughter, saying it's illegal to play outside unless a parent is standing right there. And this is America. You know, my wife's a little bit more cautious, but I'm a little bit of a free range parent. And so I encourage my kids. I'm like, you can ride your bike down the street. We live on a private road to your friend's house. And there really is an importance to kids getting that independence and not just kind of living in bubble wrap all the time. Again, I always hasten to say, parents make the decision. Some parents are going to be maybe a little bit more cautious. Other parents are going to be a little bit more free range. But this is America. We don't have cops showing up to arrest you, and this is an embarrassment. The good thing is there was such a bipartisan opposition to Brittany Patterson's arrest. Parental Rights Foundation, HSLDA backed this, but reasonable independence for kids law just passed in Georgia, passed the Senate, passed the House. It's on its way to the governor's desk, and I don't think we will see another parent in Georgia or in many other states arrested for something like this anymore. So it's common sense. If you have not checked out the work of Parental Rights Foundation and Let Grow, encourage you to look at them, their model bills, and the work that these two great organizations, the work that I'm proud that HSLDA is supporting as well. It's a bipartisan issue. In Virginia, it passed unanimously in our House and Senate, and then Governor Youngkin signed it into law. And, you know, let kids be kids. Stop arresting parents for something that kids did regularly in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And, that generation turned out very well.
Amen to that. Well, that's some good news about that law about to be passed in Georgia. That's really encouraging. And you know, what's interesting too, I think, is that clip was from Inside Edition. And one of the things I read about the Illinois case too is there were lots of mainstream media that were coming out against the bill. So again, it's like you said, it's common sense, and these parental rights issues are just very troubling. So let me ask you what some of the most concerning trends are that you're seeing when it comes to parental rights, particularly regarding education.
Sherry, I think I can distill all of these issues, whether it's, cops showing up on social services to force parents to sign a safety plan, or whether it's a bill like HB 2827 in Illinois that would criminalize homeschool parents simply for missing to file by August 1st a piece of paperwork. It really is a philosophical issue. Who decides how our precious children are raised, educated? Is it the government? Or is it parents? There's this that's really the age-old debate. I recently wrote a law review article. It was published last year in Liberty University School of Law. I think our listeners can just Google it. Will Estrada, HSLDA, a seismic victory for homeschool freedom. That's what's titled. And what I did was I traced the history of parental rights. I went back to the three great Abrahamic world religions: Judaism, Christianity, Islam. I looked at the Greek philosophers. I looked at the English common law writers. And universally, all of these, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, the Greek philosophers who were polytheists, the English common law philosophers, our founders, they were universal that Parents are the ones who make these decisions. The Greek philosophers looked at the animal kingdom. The Christian, Judaism, and Islam looked at kind of their holy scriptures, that God had created the family, and they were universal, that families, parents love their children more than any government bureaucrat ever would. And this was really unchallenged until the beginning of the 20th century, until the early 1900s. And so that battle that we're fighting, all of them really come down to this worldview. Who is going to make the decisions? Is it the government and some faceless bureaucrat sitting in Washington, D.C. or in a state capital? Or is it the parents, the ones who raised that child, who birthed that child, who spent those sleepless nights with that child, who would give their life for their child? And so, regardless of what these legislative battles are, it really comes down to a fundamental question: who's going to make these decisions?
Oh yes, I agree so much. And again, a great history lesson for us to understand. I think I will look up that article myself. That's fantastic. So we need to take another short break, but when we come back, I'd like to ask you about what's happening in the political realm with the new administration and the dismantling of the Federal Department of Education. Don't go away. I'll be back with my interview with Will Estrada right after this.
Who would have ever thought serious adults would be unable to answer, "What is a woman?" Title IX, written to protect girls, has morphed into a tool to shield boys pretending to be girls, putting girls at a disadvantage in sports and at risk in locker rooms. After the sexual revolution of the 60s, young women were taught to discard motherhood in favor of a career. Act more like men, they were told. Today, they're encouraged to become men through drugs and irreversible surgeries. In 2018, Dr. Lisa Lippman conducted a study on the rise of rapid-onset gender dysphoria, mostly among females, a complex change of cultural norms, and warned that caution is warranted. Caution? U.S. Parents Involved Education believes it's time to act to save our girls. Tune in next week for more insights from U.S. Parents Involved in Education and connect with us at USPIE on X and Facebook. To join the movement, visit uspie.org.
Welcome back to Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few. With me today is Will Estrada from HSLDA and parentalrights.org. Our mission here at USPIE is to return education to its proper local roots and restore parental authority over their children's education by closing the U.S. Department of Education and ending all federal education mandates. Will, what are your thoughts on the momentum of the new administration and the apparent dismantling of the Department of Education under Linda McMahon?
Well, Sherry, let me preface this by saying that as you read in my first bio, I served as a federal bureaucrat. I was part of the career civil service, worked through two administrations, President Trump in the first term, and then President Biden. I was in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services in the Office for Civil Rights. Enjoyed my time there. There are hardworking career civil servants, but at the U.S. Department of Education, it's really, since it was founded by former President Jimmy Carter in 1979, it's essentially done nothing else than be a middleman. Congress appropriates the money, whether it's GI Bill or federal student aid or free and reduced school lunch or civil rights funding. And the money goes to Washington, D.C., which then apportions it out to the states. And since the U.S. Department of Education was founded in 1979, educational scores in our public schools have gone consistently down. We've spent since 79 about $3 trillion going to the U.S. Department of Education. And if we could point to academic success, maybe you could justify it, but we have not. And so it's time to really cut out the middleman. None of this funding is going away. President Trump's executive order that's been enthusiastically backed by Secretary McMahon, who is fantastic, by the way, would not, none of this funding would go away. It would just go to different agencies. Civil rights would be enforced by the U.S. Department of Justice, which is actually who already enforces civil rights. All the Department of Education does is write sternly written letters, and then they forward the information over to DOJ Civil Rights Division, which actually prosecutes school districts and institutions of higher education that are violating federal civil rights laws. So none of the protections that are important, whether for civil rights or whether for Title I schools or whether it's IDEA or providing special education funds, none of the benefits like federal education dollars, free and reduced school lunch, Title I. Some of those already are actually administered through the U.S. Department of Agriculture, but none of them would go away. They would go to different federal agencies. And I always remind people, and it was funny because when I worked at HHS, we still had these documents. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services actually ran most of these federal programs for public schools prior to 1979. It was called the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, HUE, and that's who ran most of these federal systems. We still had public schools prior to the U.S. Department of Education being created in 1979. It was just the federal aspect was run through different federal agencies, DOJ, Treasury, Department of Agriculture, and then, of course, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, which was previously called HUE. And so I had documents when I was a career civil servant at U.S. Department of Health and Human Services that still had that old title of Health, Education, and Welfare. So we can definitely do this. That money, which is currently going to fund bureaucrats' salaries and them to push paper around, would actually go to the states. And I think that's really what our founders intended, that the states serve as the laboratories of democracy. The states will get additional funding, which will go to their state departments of education. So there'll actually be more money going to our public schools. California might use it differently than, say, Florida or Texas would, but it gives more decisions closer to the kids in the hands of the state education departments instead of Washington, D.C.
Our organization, of course, that being our mission, this is something we've researched and opined on. And we even developed a blueprint. It's called the USPIE Blueprint to Close US Ed. It was published originally in 2018, and we updated it and republished it recently. And we mailed a copy to every congressman, to the president, to Linda McMahon, to Elon Musk. We're really hopeful that they will take a look at what we propose as far as dismantling the Department of Education. So what you've suggested is the money won't go away. It'll just be shifted to other agencies. And I think that's important for people to understand because there's this big fear that there's going to be all this money missing from education. But I'd like to broaden your perspective just slightly on this, if you don't mind. So we talked earlier about how much more money will actually be in the hands of locals if it doesn't have to go to the federal government. And I think you and I both agree that the federal government shouldn't be involved in education. It's not something that is in the Constitution. It should remain within the states. So our perspective is that taxpayers are sending their money to the federal government. A large percent of it is siphoned off to fund bureaucracy for these federal agencies, whether it's Department of Ed or Department of Agriculture, whatever federal agency is going to implement the programs or transfer the money to the states. We think it's going to be far more effective to shift the revenue collection and keep the money within the states, not send it to the federal government and, get pennies on the dollar back with regulations attached. So our plan suggests that it would be better to, after you close all the functions, obviously you have to work with Congress to change some laws. The Department of Ed cannot be closed on its own. It was instituted through statute and it has to be reversed that way. But after you take all of those steps, we believe that the tax collection should be shifted. One of the examples is the free and reduced lunch program that you mentioned. There actually are some states that are already doing their own program for free and reduced lunch because they weren't happy with the quality of the food and other problems with the program, so they instituted their own. The Head Start program is another example. There are many states that have their own early childhood programs, so there's no reason why they can't implement programs probably more effectively and obviously more efficiently as far as spending tax dollars if it's done within the state. So we're hopeful that our plan will get in the right hands, and as Congress, in fact, we're having conversations with a few congressmen who are writing bills for this purpose, so that we can hopefully not just shift the money to other agencies. That could be a temporary fix. Block grants to states could also be a temporary fix. But we think it's going to be much more efficient and effective if we shift the tax collection and retain the money within the states. I know that's a big hurdle, but it's the best way to do it in our opinion. And so if you'll just briefly give me your comments on that, and then I just have a couple of final questions for you.
Yeah, Sherry, I'm paying a lot of federal income taxes, so anything you can do to keep more money in my pocket, my wife and kids would be very happy too.
Great. So I'm glad you like that idea. I don't think anybody would argue with that. So, Will, this has been a great conversation. And so I'm going to ask you two questions that I ask all my guests at the end of our interview. And that is, what are some of your concerns regarding education, and what are some of the things you're optimistic about?
I think my biggest concern when it comes to education is authoritarianism. And there are organizations out there that want to centralize more education decisions, parental rights decisions, decisions over the family in the hands of either bureaucrats or in the hands of the government. And so, again, kind of going to that philosophical discussion I had earlier of who should be making these decisions. Should it be parents or should it be the government? That's my biggest concern of going in a direction of authoritarianism when it comes to parents, family, and just how we live our lives. The biggest thing I'm optimistic about is really what we saw post-COVID. Obviously, we went through a pandemic and everything that came along with that. But the silver lining was parents, not just homeschool parents, but parents of kids in public school, private school, and homeschool, really, number one, saw what was happening. Number two, saw that they didn't like it. And number three, determined to take charge of their children's education. And that really gives me the biggest hope that I've seen in a long time, because the most important thing is for ordinary, extraordinary moms, dads, grandparents to say, we're not going to wait around for the government to do something. We're going to take charge and we're going to get it done. And so we saw homeschooling growing. We saw parents running for school board in their public schools. We saw parents getting involved in their private schools, and we've seen significant growth in the number of kids in private education. And so wherever your children are, wherever your grandchildren are, get involved and make a difference. Don't outsource it to others. Be there, be involved, and make a difference. And I think we're really seeing that. And that will bear fruit in the years to come.
Yes, that's very encouraging. Thank you so much for sharing that. And thanks for coming on the podcast today, Will. I've really enjoyed our conversation. And thank you to our viewers and listeners for tuning in and supporting our work. Join me again next week for another episode of Unmasking Government Schools with Sherry Few.
U.S. Parents Involved in Education is a nonprofit coalition dedicated to restoring local control of education and parental authority. By empowering parents to reclaim responsibility for their children's learning and encouraging states to move away from federal influence, USPIE seeks to create a culture where parents are the primary decision makers in education and schools support families without the burden of federal mandates. If you want to start a state or regional USPIE chapter in your area, please visit uspie.org and complete the brief questionnaire in the chapter section.